Happy New Year!
Would you like to save yourself 12 minutes per week of listening to ads like this?
Well, Club Retrospectors members get an ad-free feed on their podcast app, plus weekly bonus bits and freshly baked episodes every Sunday.
And right now you can try being a member for free. Visit patreon.com/retrospectors for a week's free trial. Or click subscribe on Apple Podcasts for a 14-day free trial.
That's patreon.com/retrospectors or click subscribe in Apple Podcasts.
And hurry, because the offer ends January the 18th.
It's January 5th, 1895, and another remarkable event is about to be uncovered by Arion, Rebecca, and Olly, the Retrospectors.
Soldiers, they are degrading an innocent man. Long live France. Long live the army. That is what Alfred Dreyfus said to baying crowds today in history in 1895 as he was stripped of his rank as an artillery officer and publicly degraded. His crime? Treason, after it was revealed that he'd passed French military secrets to Germany. The problem? He didn't do it. And basically the only evidence they ever had against him was he had handwriting and he was Jewish.
Yeah, he was subject to a ritual called cashiering. It's where a disgraced officer is stripped of their insignia in front of ranks of soldiers and, in this case, the public as well, although they were behind the gates. He had his sword snapped in two in front of his fellow soldiers. If you've read anything about the Dreyfus affair, you may have seen there's lots of engravings of that particular moment. And this was all taking place in the courtyard of the War College in Paris, of which Dreyfus was a graduate. And so you can only imagine his humiliation to be publicly disgraced there in front of his fellow officers and these huge crowds at the railings hurling abuse. And tensions were high at that point because relations between France and Germany had been extremely bad since the Franco-Prussian War 20 years earlier, and that had resulted in the annexation of the formerly French region of Alsace-Lorraine, which France would eventually get back after World War I. And so there was a lot of espionage between the two nations, to the point that the French had managed to get an informant into the German embassy in Paris as a cleaner, and she used her access to have a good old rummage, and that's where the whole story began.
Yeah, she found a torn-up note, later called the bordereau, and it was unsigned, undated, but it was a note that was indicating that confidential French military documents, including details about newly developed artillery, were to be sent to a foreign power, possibly Germany itself. And this discovery triggered an urgent search for who the author was and was seen as a severe breach of national security. And what do you know, they found a Jew to pin it on.
Yeah, so Alfred Dreyfus was this high-ranking official in the War Ministry, and people were suspicious of him. He was from Alsace, that region that had been disputed. He spoke French with a German accent.
Yeah, and he had already had a fairly recent taste of the kind of discrimination that was going on with the French military and French society more widely at the time. When he was invited to take the exam to join the Army General Staff, he felt that discrimination had played a part in the process because he and the other Jewish applicant were both marked down for likability, which was just obviously a completely subjective characteristic. So Dreyfus and the other Jewish applicant launched a joint protest about their treatment, although Dreyfus did still pass and he was still admitted. But it did feel that the protester put a bit of a target on his back. And then, duly, on the 15th of October 1894, he was arrested for treason and brought in for interrogation. And Major Dupaty de Clam, who was leading the interrogation, actually placed a revolver in front of him. They knew that they didn't have very much evidence. In fact, they had no evidence because he wasn't guilty. And they hoped that he would just do the, quote, honourable thing. But Dreyfus was determined to clear his name.
And this whole business of his character ended up being super important throughout his trial, which opened on the 19th of December in 1894, was conducted in a closed court, which was really the military just basically trying to shield the weakness of its own case from public scrutiny. Dreyfus, as you say, Rebecca, rigorously defended himself. Despite this, the military relied on Alphonse Bertillon, who was this eccentric expert who came up with the theory of auto forgery, which is that someone can deliberately disguise the way that they write so as to confuse people who are going to pick up and find necessarily incriminating document. But crucially, that document continued to hold sway, as well as this fabricated group of extra information in a secret dossier that was passed on to the court, which basically also impugned Dreyfus as being gay. And the combination of being targeted as a homosexual and known to have been Jewish, they in concert were enough to discredit him in the eyes of the public. And I think when finally he was found guilty on the 22nd of December, after just a couple of hours of deliberation, I think that was a key part of why the public was willing to accept this pretty dodgy judgment, which was that, well, he's a baddie, look at him.
Yeah, and then you get a couple of weeks for the public to become baying on this day, right? They're waiting for this theatrical moment. The sword being snapped across the knee of the warrant officer towering over him was such a sort of theatrical device that the sword had actually been weakened the night before and then soldered back together, so they knew that it would snap. They snipped his epaulets and his stripes, and the crowd were screaming. Judas, they called him. Death to the Jews. This was not a sort of subliminally anti-Semitic thing. Most of the crowd were excited that he was being punished because anti-Semitism was sort of becoming legitimized and become fashionable as a result of this case. And so the punishment for him was way beyond what they'd give even someone who had committed, if you like, ordinary treason. Not just that he'd go into prison, not that just he'd be in solitary confinement, not just that it would be a lifetime sentence, but he was put onto the notorious colony, the former leper colony, Devil's Island, off French Guiana, which we've talked about on the show before. He was imprisoned in a purpose-built stone hut just for him, which was 4 by 4 meters. He was fed rotting pork, a detail that they obviously delighted in telling anti-Semites. He was manacled to his bed at night. He wasn't even able to see the sea. He could only see out the top of the roof. And the guards were ordered not to interact with him. So he couldn't, he literally, after a few years of that, was beginning to lose the ability to speak. And yet, of course, he was still protesting his innocence because he was.
Yeah, and meanwhile, back home in 1896, the French military intelligence service got a new boss, Lieutenant Colonel Georges Picquart, who got wind that a German military attaché in Paris had received a note from a French army officer called Ferdinand Esterhazy. And as Picquart began to look a little bit closer at this, he began to suspect that Esterhazy may have been the actual culprit, the traitor. Notably, his handwriting actually matched the bordereau, the memo.
That doesn't matter, because forgery or something.
Then it can't be him.
Could have been an auto-forgery double bluff, though.
Yeah, classic.
Yes, exactly.
Esterhazy had forged his own handwriting.
It's a bit more straightforward if his handwriting actually matches the note, which was the case in this one. As he looked into Esterhazy further, he found that he had a massive ego and a very thin skin. He was very bitter about perceived slights from his superior officers. He felt like he hadn't been promoted as rapidly as he would have wanted. He'd even written letters to his mistress that were later intercepted, expressing his contempt for the army. Quite a lot of evidence building up there, but Picquart's superiors would not hear him out at all. As far as they were concerned, the army had, not to use a pun, but closed ranks around this. They absolutely were not going to publicly go back on their condemnation of Dreyfus. So they actually had Picquart transferred to Tunisia to shut him up, and he eventually had to go behind their backs and send the info directly to Dreyfus's lawyers. And in January 1898, Esterhazy appeared before a court-martial, he'd made a voluntary appearance, but he was found innocent. Again, not that surprising, because conviction would have been admitting they'd got it wrong with Dreyfus. And following that verdict, there was yet more anti-Semitic rioting and disorder in Paris, because it was seen that, this upstanding Christian French army officer has been made to undergo this ordeal, but it was actually the traitor Dreyfus, as we all know. And after that verdict was when we finally see maybe the one thing that people might know about the Dreyfus affair, if they haven't read up on it, is that famous letter by the novelist Émile Zola headlined J'accuse.
Yeah, the J'accuse letter was published on the front page of L'Aurore newspaper in France, and basically Zola was just outraged by the acquittal of Esterhazy, and he began naming names and directly attacked the French military and government. He compiled all known evidence of the conspiracy against Dreyfus, and his aim really was to provoke a trial and force public scrutiny back on the affair. And the article caused this immediate immediate sensation and prompted a huge amount of support and violent opposition to everything that had happened to Dreyfus, and it turned into a national crisis. It became known not as the Dreyfus affair, but the affair. You know, the petition was calling for a retrial, and it was signed by some major names, including Marcel Proust and Claude Monet, and that further mobilized public opinion and was leading not just to like a few bad apples, but to the whole of the aristocracy and the orthodoxy of the French hierarchy at the time.
Yeah, and it was a major international incident by this point as well. It was an embarrassment for France. Queen Victoria, for example, watching from London, was very pro-Dreyfus, or Dreyfusard, as they called themselves. The nation was sort of split into Dreyfusard and anti-Dreyfusard. She was a Dreyfusard and believed that he'd been wrongly convicted. But the French people as a whole were anti-Dreyfusard. And, this is a highly literate society in France by nearly in the 20th century now. There were 55 daily newspapers across France at this time. Only 8 of them were Dreyfusard. Almost all of those had low circulation numbers. So yes, J'accuse got published on the front of a prominent Paris newspaper, but pretty much every other newspaper was saying, yes, but he's a Jew. To the extent that, like, one of the newspapers even carried the words, the anti-Semitic newspaper, on its masthead, proudly. Like, that was what you bought if you wanted to read that stuff. Wow. So there was this conflict. Polite opinion around the world might think that they'd wrongly convicted him, but the French people wanted him to stay on Devil's Island.
Yeah, so as you're saying, this put the French government in an awkward position, and they came up with a kind of strange compromise, which was that in 1899 they brought Dreyfus back to France for a retrial, but he was once again convicted, despite the fact that one of the key pieces of evidence was a letter between an Italian military attaché and a German military attaché in which they appeared to suggest that Dreyfus was involved in some dodgy dealings. But that letter had actually been written by a major in the French army who had recently committed suicide, admitting that he had forged that letter. That fact in itself was not admitted into what was another closed trial. But as a middle ground, what they offered was that he would not have to return to Devil's Island. He would be released, but he would still officially be guilty. He would then just be offered a pardon. Obviously, this was very painful for Dreyfus, who had a very rigid military sense of personal honour, but he knew that he could not physically or mentally survive returning to Devil's Island, so he accepted the pardon, although he made it very clear that he did maintain his innocence. He spent 2 years then under house arrest, and it wasn't until July 1906 that the day he had been waiting for arrived. After a lengthy inquiry, the Court of Cassation, which is France's highest court, exonerated him, finally clearing his name.
Yeah, it's funny that sort of middle ground that they had found before this, where they found Dreyfus guilty of treason, quote, with extenuating circumstances, and then pardoned him.
This is an Arrested Development, light treason.
Yeah.
But even though the Dreyfus affair was seen for a lot of European Jews as a very powerful example of how fragile their acceptance by mainstream society was, Dreyfus himself never lost his faith in France or in the French military. He was offered his position in the army back, which I think most of us would have just laughed that idea out of the room, but he really wanted to be reinstated, so he rejoined the army. He did resign the following year. His health had been quite severely impacted by his imprisonment on Devil's Island, but he came out of retirement to serve in World War I alongside his son Pierre, who was a soldier on the front lines, while his wife Lucy worked as a Red Cross nurse.
Yeah, so he was there for the whole of World War I and rejoined the army, and so did his entire family. Like, worst traitor ever.
Tomorrow.
And in his patent, he describes the skates as being intended to perform in the apartments everything that skaters can do on the ice.
Ditch the ads and get a Sunday episode when you join Club Retrospectors. Patreon.com/Retrospectors.